In the rugged land of the Wyoming Territory, a small town finds itself caught between the menace of a band of ruthless outlaws and the quiet resilience of an old cowboy, forgotten by most, but not by those who know his name. When these outlaws pick on the elderly cowboy, they fail to realize the man they're mocking is no ordinary ranch hand. With a legendary aim and a reputation that once stretched across the frontier, this cowboy is about to teach them a lesson they'll never forget. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button for our YouTube channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming stories. Your support truly helps us share these hard-hitting stories with more people. It was late in the afternoon when the old man rode into the small, dusty town of Red Rock, Wyoming. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a deep orange glow across the land. His horse, a sturdy brown gelding, moved at a steady pace, its hooves kicking up the dirt in rhythmic thuds. The old cowboy had been on the trail for days, moving through the vast open plains, his weathered face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, his eyes narrowed against the sun. The town of Red Rock wasn't much, just a few old wooden buildings, a livery, a small general store, and a saloon that was the heart of the town's evening activity. There wasn't much for a man to do here, unless you were looking for trouble, and trouble always found its way to places like this. The old cowboy had been coming and going from towns like Red Rock for years, and he learned a few things about staying low. His name was Mallister, though most folks had long since forgotten it. He wasn't a man who made waves, not anymore. He had left the life of fighting, gunfights, and chasing down outlaws behind him long ago. He was just trying to live out the rest of his years in peace. That was the plan, anyway. As he rode through the town, the few folk who were milling about stopped and watched him pass. There was something about the old man that made people take notice. Maybe it was the way he sat tall in the saddle, the steady rhythm of his horse's gait, or the way his hand rested casually near the holstered revolver at his side. Whatever it was, the townspeople didn't say much. They'd learned that it was better not to bother strangers, especially one like Mallister. Cole pulled his horse to a stop near the hitching post outside the saloon. He dismounted with ease, despite his age, and tied the reins to a nearby post. His body ached as he moved, the years of hard work and hard living catching up to him. He took a deep breath, letting the dust settle around him. He hadn't been in Red Rock for years, but it felt familiar, like a place where a man could rest for a while. He hadn't intended to stay long, but the road was long, and maybe he'd find some peace here. Inside the saloon, the usual crowd of miners, ranch hands, and drifters filled the space. The low murmur of voices mixed with the clink of glasses and the shuffle of cards. At the bar, a couple of men sat hunched over their drinks, whispering to each other, their eyes darting around the room. Their gazes flicked briefly toward the door when it opened, but it was clear they weren't too interested in the newcomer. That is, until they saw him. Mallister wasn't exactly a stranger to trouble. Over the years, the old cowboy had learned how to keep his distance, how to fade into the background of a town. But trouble didn't always leave a man alone, and sometimes trouble found you. As he stepped into the saloon, the door swinging shut behind him, Mallister's presence drew a few curious looks from the regulars. He didn't bother with a greeting. He wasn't here for conversation. He was here for a drink and maybe a place to rest his bones. But fate had other plans. Across the room, a group of outlaws sat at a corner table, laughing and drinking heavily. They were a rough bunch, young, brash, and unafraid of trouble. They had taken over the saloon a few days ago, making themselves at home. Most of the townsfolk steered clear of them, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire. These were the kind of men who thought they owned the place, the kind of men who would pick on anyone they deemed weak. And today, they had set their sights on Mallister. The largest of the group, a man named Carver, noticed the old cowboy immediately. He sneered, his hand reaching for his glass. His companions followed his gaze, sizing Mallister up with drunken eyes. They had nothing but disdain for the old man, especially when they noticed the way he moved. It wasn't the way a man of his age should move. No, Mallister moved like a man who had seen and survived more than his fair share of trouble. Carver stood up slowly, his boots thudding heavily on the wooden floor as he made his way toward Mallister. The other outlaws followed, eager for some entertainment. They weren't used to being ignored, and the old cowboy's indifference stoked their egos. Well, Carver drawled, stopping just a few feet from Mallister. Look what we got here, boys. An old man riding into town like he owns the place. He grinned, clearly amused by the situation. What's your name, old man? Mallister didn't answer right away. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the bar, his eyes never leaving Carver. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't afraid of men like these. But he wasn't looking for trouble either. He just wanted a drink, and maybe a little peace. Carver, sensing the old man's disinterest, took a step closer. I'm talking to you, old man. Don't ignore me. Mallister turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Carver's gaze out of the corner of his eye. His voice was quiet, his words slow and deliberate, but they carried the weight of years lived on the edge of danger. I'm not looking for trouble, he said calmly. You'd be wise to leave me be. The room went silent for a brief moment as the other men watched. Carver's smirk faltered, and for a second, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. A flash of recognition, maybe, but it passed quickly, and Carver just laughed. Oh, we've got ourselves a quiet one, huh? He leaned in closer, his voice lowering. Well, I'm not letting you just waltz into my town and ignore me. Mallister's eyes hardened, his fingers tightening around the glass of whiskey he had just ordered. He wasn't a young man anymore, but he'd learned a thing or two in his years. He'd faced men like Carver before, and he'd survived. The outlaws surrounding him were about to learn just how legendary Mallister's reputation really was. The tension in the room was palpable, like the stillness before a storm. The outlaws surrounded Mallister, their eyes sharp and full of judgment. They had been looking for a fight, and Mallister, with his quiet presence, had become the perfect target. Buck Carver leaned in, his face twisted into a smirk, clearly hoping the old cowboy would show some fear. But Mallister wasn't showing any. Carver's hand lingered near the handle of his revolver, just within reach. He was trying to intimidate the old man, to provoke a reaction. But Mallister didn't flinch. He hadn't flinched in years, not since the days when the gunfights had been more frequent and the world seemed to always be on the brink of violence. Now, his mind was calm, his hands steady. He had been here before. I said, "Don't ignore me," Carver repeated, his voice tinged with a threat. He stepped even closer, his boots creaking on the floorboards as he put his face inches from Mallister's. The other outlaws shifted, eager to see what would happen, all of them waiting for the old man to back down. Mallister finally turned to face Carver fully, his sharp blue eyes cold and unwavering. He studied the younger man for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them. Then, without a word, he reached for his own glass, lifting it slowly to his lips. His movements were deliberate, measured, showing no hint of haste. Carver's temper flared. "You think you're better than us, old man?" he sneered, his hand now resting on the revolver at his side. "You think just because you've got a few years on the rest of us, you're untouchable?" Mallister set the glass down on the bar, his fingers brushing against the rim. The saloon was unnervingly quiet now, save for the sound of his soft voice. "I'm not interested in your trouble, but if you're looking for it, you'll find it. And you won't like what you find." The calm in Mallister's tone seemed to deflate Carver's bravado for a moment. There was something in the old man's eyes, something that made Carver hesitate. But the hesitation was brief. It was quickly replaced by a reckless, youthful arrogance that had no respect for age or experience. "Doesn't matter who you are," Carver spat. "I've got no use for old men who think they can waltz through my town without answering for it." He drew his gun in one swift motion. The sound of it clearing the holster was like a drumbeat to Mallister's ears. But even as Carver's revolver came up, Mallister's eyes never left his face. In the next instant, Mallister's hand moved faster than anyone expected. With a fluid motion, he grabbed his own revolver from the holster, his fingers a blur. The crack of the gunshot was deafening in the small room. Carver's gun dropped to the floor before he could even squeeze off a shot. The bullet had hit him in the hand, sending the weapon flying. His face contorted in pain and disbelief as he staggered back, clutching his bleeding hand. The outlaws who had been so eager to watch a fight now stared in stunned silence. They hadn't expected the old cowboy to move that fast, to respond with that kind of precision. They had underestimated him. They had thought he was just some old man, an easy target. But Mallister was something else entirely. Mallister's revolver was still aimed at Carver, steady and calm in his grip. He didn't need to say a word. The message had already been delivered. His eyes locked with Carver's, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "You made a mistake," Mallister said quietly, his voice cool, his face impassive. "I don't take kindly to being provoked." The outlaws hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat. They had been quick to mock the old cowboy, but now they were unsure how to proceed. Carver, still holding his injured hand, scowled at Mallister but didn't make a move. The pain in his hand was searing, but it wasn't the injury that stung. It was the realization that he had been outclassed. Mallister didn't lower his revolver. He didn't need to. The room was still, the tension thick in the air. One wrong move from any of them, and the next shot would be fired. It was that simple. The saloon door creaked open then, breaking the silence. A few more cowhands and townsfolk had come to see what the commotion was about, but they stopped in their tracks when they saw the standoff. Mallister didn't look at them. His eyes stayed fixed on Carver. "You want to keep this going? Or are you going to leave?" Carver's jaw clenched. He knew he had been beaten. He could feel the blood dripping from his hand, and he could see the resolve in Mallister's eyes. The old man wasn't bluffing. He wasn't like the others Carver had dealt with, weak, scared, or quick to fold. Mallister was calm, controlled, and deadly. With a curse under his breath, Carver backed off, still clutching his hand. "This ain't over," he muttered. "You'll regret this, old man." Mallister didn't answer. He didn't need to. The message had been clear. Carver knew the consequences now. He knew better than to test Mallister's patience again. The band of outlaws, now realizing that the old cowboy wasn't someone to mess with, began to gather their things and make their way toward the door. As they left, Mallister holstered his gun, the movement smooth and practiced. He wasn't interested in making a spectacle out of it. He hadn't fired to kill. He'd fired to send a message. And it was a message that would echo in Red Rock long after the dust had settled. The saloon was quiet again, but the tension was still thick. The people inside, the ones who had witnessed the exchange, were left speechless. The old cowboy wasn't just a cowboy. He was something else entirely. The bartender, a young man who had been watching the entire event from behind the bar, hesitated before speaking. "You're a legend, ain't you?" he asked softly, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. Mallister didn't answer right away. He simply turned, his face unreadable, and walked toward the back door. "I'm just a man trying to get by," he said, the weight of years in his voice. "But if you're asking if I've seen my fair share of gunfights, the answer's yes." With that, he left the saloon, disappearing into the fading daylight, his horse waiting patiently outside. The wind had started to pick up again as Mallister stepped out of the saloon and onto the dusty street. The golden hue of the setting sun was fading, giving way to the cold bite of evening. He moved toward his horse without looking back, his boots sinking slightly into the loose dirt with every step. The small town of Red Rock was still, the once lively saloon now emptied of its rowdy patrons. Mallister didn't need to watch the outlaws leave. He had already sent his message. If they were smart, they'd get out of town and keep moving. But Mallister had lived long enough to know that outlaws weren't usually known for their smarts. They'd be back, and they'd be looking for revenge. He had little doubt that this wasn't the end of the trouble. His horse, a sturdy gray named Dusty, stood tied to the post, her head hanging low as if she too felt the weight of the situation. Mallister approached her slowly, running his hand along her mane. His bones ached, and his fingers, though steady, felt the wear of time. He wasn't as fast as he used to be, not by a long shot, but the eye, the mind, and the steady hand had a way of making up for a lot of that. As he mounted Dusty, he caught sight of the bartender from the saloon, standing in the doorway, watching him with wide eyes. Mallister gave him a brief nod but didn't speak. He didn't need to. The man had seen what had happened. The legend, or at least what was left of it, had shown itself. The sound of the outlaws' horses fading into the distance was a welcome one, but Mallister knew that silence in a town like this wasn't always a good sign. The sound of hooves could be the beginning of something much worse. He turned his horse in the direction of the nearby hills. There was a spot there, just out of town, where he could rest for the night, get his bearings, and try to piece together what had just happened. It wasn't a place he would have chosen to stop under normal circumstances, but tonight wasn't normal. Mallister kicked Dusty into motion, her hooves thundering against the ground as they moved away from town. The further he got from Red Rock, the less the weight of the situation seemed to press down on him. But he knew better. He had felt this before. The calm after a fight wasn't peace. It was just the quiet before the next round, and he could feel the storm brewing on the horizon. By the time he reached the outcrop overlooking the town, the sun had set completely, leaving the sky dark and the air cooler. He dismounted and led Dusty to the small camp he'd set up years ago. It was a simple setup, a bedroll, some supplies, and a fire pit he'd used countless times when he was on the move. He hadn't made a fire yet, not wanting to draw attention, but he would soon enough. Cole sat down on a nearby rock, rubbing his weathered face with a hand. It had been a long time since he'd had to draw his gun, even longer since he'd been in a town that needed him to. But the outlaws had made their move, and in doing so, they'd pulled him back into a life he thought he had left behind. He sighed and untied his saddlebags from Dusty, unpacking his provisions for the night. His mind, however, kept drifting back to the events in the saloon. It wasn't the outlaws themselves that bothered him. It was the look in their eyes when they saw him, the way they underestimated him. They hadn't known who he was, and that was the problem. Mallister had learned long ago that legends weren't always what they seemed. People liked to romanticize gunfighters, to imagine them as invincible. But the reality was far different. Legends were men with mistakes behind them, scars that didn't always heal, and choices that haunted them in the quiet moments. He pulled a tin cup from his saddlebags, poured himself some coffee, and looked down at the lights of Red Rock far below. He had seen towns like it fall before. He had seen men like Carver and his gang roll into places just like it, taking what they wanted with little more than a smile and a drawn gun. He had also seen what happened when a man fought back. A small crackling noise from behind him made Mallister snap his attention to the shadows. He was already reaching for his revolver when he saw a figure step out from the darkness, hands raised in a non-threatening manner. "Easy there, cowboy," a voice called out softly. "Not here to cause trouble." Mallister's hand paused over the gun, his eyes narrowing. He had no interest in entertaining any more surprises tonight, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. He let his hand relax, though his fingers remained close to the grip. The figure stepped closer into the dim light of the campfire. It was a woman, her face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, and her movements cautious, as though she didn't want to startle him. Mallister said nothing, just watched her carefully. "You don't look like you're from around here," she said, her voice steady, yet carrying a tone of something Mallister couldn't quite place. "I'm not," he replied tersely. "Just passing through." The woman nodded, glancing toward Red Rock in the distance. "I saw what happened in town. The outlaws, I mean." Mallister remained silent, watching her carefully. She didn't seem like she was a threat, but he knew better than to trust a stranger too easily. "You're Cole Mallister, ain't you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly, though she seemed to be keeping her distance. Mallister's expression didn't change. He took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "I am. What's it to you?" The woman took a step closer, her eyes scanning the area as though she expected someone else to show up. "I've heard the stories about you, about how you don't miss a shot." Mallister's gaze hardened. "Stories? Don't believe everything you hear." She didn't flinch, her stance still steady. "I know who you are, Cole. I also know you're not just some old cowboy looking for a quiet life. You've been part of something bigger than this, and I need your help." Mallister didn't respond immediately. He wasn't used to being pulled into someone else's fight, but the look in her eyes, the urgency, told him that she wasn't someone who would give up easily. "You've got the wrong man," he said flatly. She didn't take a step back. Instead, she stood there, waiting. "You were once a legend, Mallister. A man who could put down anyone who stood in his way. That man's still in you, isn't he?" McAllister stared at her for a long time. The silence between them stretched out like a canyon. The fire flickered, casting shadows across his face. Finally, he spoke. "You're asking the wrong questions." The night air seemed to hold its breath as Cole McAllister and the woman stood facing each other in the flickering glow of the campfire. Dusty shifted uneasily beside him, as though sensing the tension hanging in the air. McAllister hadn't moved his hand from his revolver, though it remained just out of sight. He wasn't sure what this woman wanted, but he was damn certain she wasn't here for a friendly chat. She wasn't the type to make idle conversation. That much was clear from the way she stood. Her posture solid and unwavering, her eyes keen. McAllister had learned to read people over the years, and this woman wasn't someone who backed down easily. She wasn't afraid of him, which was rare in itself. Most people would have been, especially after seeing how he had handled the outlaws in Red Rock. But this woman? She was different. He took another long sip from his tin cup, the bitter taste of coffee grounding him as his eyes never left her. "You want something? Or are you just gonna stand there all night?" Her gaze didn't falter. She shifted slightly, crossing her arms, her voice steady as she spoke. "I'm looking for help, and I've heard you're the man to ask." McAllister didn't flinch, but the tone of her voice carried something. Desperation, maybe, or perhaps urgency. Either way, it wasn't the sort of thing that would make him warm up to her. "I'm not a gunslinger anymore," he muttered, his words low, but enough to let her know where he stood. He wasn't the man he used to be. The memories of those days, of being the fastest draw in the West, had faded over time, replaced by the ache of years and the desire for solitude. "You're not fooling anyone," she replied, a slight smirk crossing her face, though there was no humor in it. "I've seen the way you handled those outlaws in the saloon. I've heard the stories about how you once stopped a whole gang of robbers with nothing but a rifle and a steady hand. They say you can hit a rattlesnake from 100 paces. McAllister's eyes narrowed. "Stories are just that. Stories." The woman leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "And yet here we are. Those stories are real, aren't they?" McAllister remained silent, his gaze cold. He wasn't ready to revisit the past. He wasn't sure he ever would be. She studied him for a moment longer, then sighed, almost as if realizing she wasn't going to get any answers out of him just yet. "There's a gang," she said finally, her voice becoming more urgent. "A group of men led by a man named Gren. They've been terrorizing the towns along the northern pass. They're ruthless, and they've taken everything from anyone who gets in their way. I've been tracking them for weeks, and I think they're headed for Red Rock next." McAllister's brow furrowed. "And you think I'm going to help you stop them?" She nodded slowly, her face hardening with determination. "I know you've got your reasons for staying out of the fight, but you've seen what happens when people like Graydon get too powerful. I'm not asking you to fight my fight. I'm asking you to help stop them before they destroy any more lives." For a long moment, McAllister didn't respond. He could feel the weight of her words sinking in. He had seen men like Graydon before. Men who took whatever they wanted, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. It wasn't just the law they were breaking. It was the lives they were ruining. "I'm not a hero," McAllister finally said, his voice rough with the weight of truth. "I've got no fight left in me." The woman stepped closer, her eyes locking with his. "But you've got a choice. You don't have to be a hero. You just have to stop them before they take everything." McAllister felt the weight of those words pressing against his chest. He had fought enough battles in his life to know that no one ever truly walked away from a fight. And as much as he had wanted to stay out of it, the reality was that this wasn't something he could ignore. He sighed, his hand rubbing his jaw as he turned away, looking toward the distant lights of Red Rock. The town would be in danger if those outlaws arrived. He could feel it in his bones, the same old feeling that had kept him in the game for so long. "You've got a hard way to go," he muttered, more to himself than to her. She nodded, understanding what he meant. "I've been doing this alone for too long, but I can't take them on by myself. And I'm betting you're the only one left who can make sure they don't burn Red Rock to the ground." McAllister stared into the fire for a long time, lost in thought. It had been years since he had taken up arms for someone else. But something about her words, something about the way she had looked at him, made him feel like maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to do the right thing. He looked at her again, his gaze hardening with resolve. I don't do things half-hearted. If we're gonna take on Graydon and his gang, we do it right. But you need to know something. Once we start this, there's no backing out. She held his gaze without flinching. I'm ready. Are you? Mallister let out a long breath, his hand tightening around the revolver at his side. For the first time in years, something inside him stirred. The old fire that had long since been buried beneath the dust of forgotten days was flickering again. I reckon I am, he said quietly. Let's get it done. The night was darker now, the sky thick with clouds, and the distant rumble of thunder warned of a storm on the way. Cole Mallister and the woman, whose name he had learned was Sarah, rode side by side, heading back toward Red Rock. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and the steady sound of Dusty's hooves against the dirt was the only sound that accompanied them as they traveled. Sarah had proven herself quick with a rifle and sharp with a blade, but Mallister still wasn't sure about trusting her completely. The young woman had a fire in her, that much was clear, but he wasn't in the habit of trusting people easily. He'd learned long ago that even the most well-intentioned allies could turn the tide against you when the time came. They had ridden for hours, the cold air biting at Mallister's face, his weathered coat doing little to block the chill. His mind was racing, though his face remained calm. The memories of his old life, the fast gunfights, the endless trails of blood that followed him. It all felt like a distant echo now, but it was coming back to him, sharper than ever. He had sworn off that life. He had walked away, but when the storm rolled in, it always seemed to find him again. Do you think we'll make it in time? Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. She had been quiet for most of the ride, but now she looked at him with a question in her eyes. Mallister didn't immediately answer. He glanced up at the darkening sky, the clouds swirling ominously overhead. We'll get there when we get there. We've got no choice but to keep moving. Sarah nodded, but Mallister could tell she wasn't satisfied with the answer. He wasn't either. Time was slipping away, and every second that passed was another second for Graydon's gang to get closer to Red Rock. The longer they waited, the harder it would be to stop them. They crested a small hill, and below them, the lights of Red Rock blinked in the distance. The town looked small from here, almost insignificant against the vast, empty plains surrounding it. But Mallister knew better. He knew what kind of trouble could fit into a small town. Trouble like Graydon. We need to move fast, Mallister said, urging Dusty into a faster gait. Sarah followed closely behind him, her horse keeping pace. As they rode, Mallister's mind raced. What would they find when they reached the town? Would the outlaws already be there, waiting for them? Or could they catch them before they had the chance to cause real damage? Are you sure you're up for this? Sarah called out, her voice carrying over the sound of hooves. I mean, you're not exactly a young man anymore. This isn't just some cattle rustlers we're dealing with. These men have been terrorizing towns for weeks. Mallister didn't slow down. His eyes remained fixed ahead. I'm not in this to play hero, he said, his voice sharp. But I don't stand by while men like Graydon take what doesn't belong to them. This town doesn't deserve what's coming for it. You're right, Sarah agreed, her voice quieter now. No one deserves that kind of treatment. But we can't do it alone. We need help. Mallister shook his head. If there was help to be had, it would have already arrived. The town's already been through enough. We'll deal with it ourselves. The thought of bringing in reinforcements, of asking for help from townsfolk who had never fought a gunfight in their lives, seemed almost ridiculous to Mallister. They were too far gone already. If they didn't act fast, Red Rock would be no more than another town burned to the ground by men like Graydon and his gang. As they approached the town's edge, Mallister could feel the unease building in his chest. The place was eerily quiet, as if everyone knew what was coming and had chosen to hide away. The wind had picked up, and the first drops of rain began to fall, light at first, but quickly turning into a steady downpour. They rode down the main street, the mud slick beneath their horses' hooves. The buildings around them stood silent, their windows dark and empty. The saloon, the general store. Everything looked untouched, as though no one had bothered to even open their doors. The streets were empty, and Mallister couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Where is everyone?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. She was clearly uneasy, and Mallister couldn't blame her. Red Rock didn't look like a town waiting for a fight. It looked like a town that had already given up. "They're hiding," Mallister muttered under his breath. "The question is, are they hiding from Graydon or from us?" As they approached the saloon, Mallister signaled for Sarah to stop. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. The door to the saloon was ajar, and the faint sounds of voices could be heard inside, though they were muffled by the storm. Mallister gestured for Sarah to stay put and moved toward the door, his hand on the handle. He pushed the door open gently, stepping into the dimly lit saloon. The sound of the rain outside seemed to vanish as soon as he entered, the heavy wooden door closing behind him with a soft thud. The room was almost empty, save for a few men hunched over tables, their voices low and tense. A handful of the town's regulars, a few miners and ranchers who had been staying in town, looked up when Mallister entered. Their eyes were wary, their hands twitching at the sight of his gun. He didn't draw it, but his presence was enough to make the room fall silent. "Where are the outlaws?" Mallister asked, his voice quiet but commanding. "We're not here for a drink. We're here to stop Graydon's gang before they get any further." One of the miners, a burly man with a thick beard, stood up slowly. "They're in the back, waiting," he said, his voice tense. "They came in a couple of hours ago, said they were looking for trouble. We didn't know who else to call." Mallister nodded, his face grim. He didn't need to hear more. He had come here to fight, and that fight was about to begin. The saloon was quiet again, the low murmur of the townsfolk suddenly replaced by the sound of the rain beating against the roof. Mallister's hand tightened around the revolver at his side as he glanced over at Sarah. She was standing near the door, watching the scene unfold with a tense, unreadable expression. The miner who had spoken was still standing, his gaze flicking nervously between Mallister and the rest of the room. The tension was thick enough to cut through, and Mallister could feel every set of eyes on him. The air smelled of whiskey and sweat, and the silence in the room was the kind that warned of an impending storm. Though, in Mallister's experience, the real storms didn't come with thunder and rain. They came with gunfire. He motioned toward the back of the saloon, his voice low. "We're going to confront them now. Stay close." Sarah nodded, the rifle slung over her back moving slightly as she followed him, her boots silent against the floor. Mallister's eyes didn't leave the backroom door. He had a feeling this wasn't going to be as easy as walking in and taking down a few bandits. They reached the door. Mallister could hear muffled voices coming from the other side, low and full of menace. His hand instinctively went to his holster, the weight of the revolver a constant presence. He didn't know if the men on the other side knew who he was yet, but they would find out soon enough. Mallister pushed open the door with a single, quiet motion, the hinges squeaking just enough to announce their presence. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering oil lamp in the corner. 4 men were seated around a table, and from the way they all looked up, Mallister knew they had already seen him come in. The biggest of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered outlaw with a scar running down his cheek, stood slowly. He was the one Mallister had seen before, Graydon, the leader of the gang, the one who had been terrorizing towns up and down the frontier. "Well, well," Graydon said, his voice a gravelly drawl that seemed to hold no surprise. "Look who's come to play. The old man himself. I thought you'd be more trouble than this, but here you are, just a step too slow." Mallister's eyes narrowed. He didn't answer at first. His hand hovered near his revolver, but he wasn't going to draw it just yet. Graydon was waiting for him to act, to make the first move. Mallister wasn't in the mood to play their game. "Your men made a mistake," Mallister said, his voice calm but filled with that same weight he'd carried for years. "I'm not someone you want to cross." Graydon's eyes flashed with something, amusement or maybe annoyance, but he didn't draw his own gun. Instead, he glanced back at the others, who were still seated, watching the exchange with lazy, bored expressions. "You've been out of the game too long, old man," Graydon said, a sneer creeping onto his face. "We don't need to hear your threats. We're here to take what we want, and there's nothing you or anyone else can do about it. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes never leaving the outlaws. You're wrong, she said firmly. This town's got a different kind of fight in it, and you won't be taking anything here. Graydon laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that bounced off the walls. The town's already ours. You can either walk away, or you can end up like the rest of these fools who've tried to stop me. He took a step forward, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. What'll it be? McAllister's fingers twitched. His mind raced for a split second, running through the options in his head. He could try to talk them down, but there was no point. Graydon wasn't interested in a fair fight. He wanted dominance. And McAllister had learned long ago that some men didn't understand anything but force. I don't walk away, McAllister said softly, but with all the finality of a man who had made his choice. Before Graydon could respond, McAllister's hand was at his side, the revolver drawn in a single, smooth motion. The room erupted in the sound of gunshots, but McAllister was already moving, his aim steady and his hands calm. The first shot rang out, hitting one of the outlaws square in the chest, the impact sending him sprawling backward. Graydon and his men reacted, pulling their guns, but McAllister was already a step ahead. The old cowboy's hand was steady, his eyes unblinking as he drew his second shot, taking down another man before the others could even make it to their feet. The third outlaw barely had time to reach for his weapon before McAllister's revolver cracked again, sending him tumbling to the floor, his body jerking with the force of the bullet. Graydon, now visibly shaken, reached for his own gun, but McAllister was faster. The last outlaw standing had barely time to raise his weapon before McAllister's fourth shot rang out, taking the man's gun hand clean off and leaving him screaming in pain. Graydon, now the only one left standing, stumbled backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had seen men die before, but the speed and precision with which McAllister had taken down his men was something entirely different. For a brief moment, fear flashed in Graydon's eyes. You're not just some old man, Graydon spat, his voice thick with rage. You're a goddamn legend. McAllister didn't flinch. His revolver was still aimed at Graydon, the barrel steady, his aim true. And legends don't die easily, he said softly. For a moment, the room was deathly quiet. Graydon's eyes darted around the room, looking for any way out, but there was nowhere to go. McAllister had cornered him, and now the fight was over. Graydon finally raised his hands, his chest heaving with panic. I'll leave, he said quickly, his voice unsteady. You won this round, old man. But this ain't over. We'll be back. McAllister didn't hesitate. He fired once more, this time at the floor near Graydon's feet, sending a shower of splinters into the air. Get out of my town, McAllister ordered. Graydon didn't need another hint. He bolted for the door, scrambling to get out of the room as fast as he could, the sound of his boots hitting the wood echoing through the silent saloon. McAllister holstered his revolver slowly, his movements steady, like he had done it 1,000 times before. He turned towards Sarah, his expression unreadable. We're not done yet, he said quietly, but we've got them on the run. For now, Sarah nodded, though the look in her eyes told McAllister that she knew the truth. Graydon and his gang would be back, and next time, it wouldn't be just a handful of men. The tension in the air was thick as McAllister and Sarah stood amidst the wreckage of the back room. The outlaws were gone, for now, but their scent of danger still lingered in the corners of the saloon. The men who had witnessed the showdown had slowly returned to their seats, casting nervous glances toward McAllister as they resumed their quiet conversations. Some pretended not to notice, but McAllister could feel their eyes on him, the unspoken recognition of what had just transpired. He hadn't expected Graydon's men to go down so easily, but that was the reality of it. Legends weren't made for show. They were forged in moments like this, when life and death hung by a thread. McAllister wasn't just another cowboy, and tonight, he had made sure of it. You sure we're done with them? Sarah's voice broke through the murmur of the room, her tone still filled with that quiet determination. McAllister took a deep breath, leaning against the bar, his hand brushing the worn wood. Not by a long shot, he replied, his voice heavy with experience. They'll be back. Men like Graydon don't take losing lightly. Sarah's eyes flicked toward the door, her gaze distant. The storm that had started out in the open fields was now creeping closer to Red Rock. The wind had picked up, and Mallister could feel the weight of the coming change. This fight wasn't over, not by a long stretch. "I don't trust them to just leave," Sarah said, her voice quieter now, almost as if she were thinking out loud. "They'll come back, and next time, they won't be so easily intimidated." Mallister nodded slowly. "Next time, we won't be able to send them running. We'll need a plan, one that doesn't rely on the luck of a quick draw." He glanced over at the bar, where the bartender had been watching from behind the counter. The man had a look on his face, part admiration, part fear. He had seen the violence, but he knew better than to voice an opinion. Mallister didn't need the praise. What he needed was information. "You know anything about Graydon?" Mallister asked the bartender, his voice flat, as though it were an afterthought. The bartender hesitated, clearly unsure whether to speak. He finally nodded, his voice low. "I've heard things. He's got a reputation. Robberies, killings, nothing new, but he's been getting bolder lately. Last couple of towns he hit, they didn't even have a chance to fight back. They were wiped out before they knew what was happening." Sarah stepped forward, her eyes focused, ready for any answer that might give them an edge. "So, you're saying he's not just a regular bandit? He's been taking out whole towns?" The bartender nodded again. "That's the word. Red Rock's been small enough to avoid his attention, but I don't think that's going to last." Mallister sighed, rubbing a hand through his graying hair. The familiar weight of responsibility sat heavily on him. He had tried to avoid it for years, but fate always seemed to drag him back. Sarah was right. Graydon wouldn't stop, and Mallister had no intention of sitting back and letting the gang tear Red Rock apart. "Do you have any idea how many men he's traveling with?" Mallister asked, his tone sharp. The bartender swallowed, clearly uneasy at the question. "I've heard 10 to 15, all hardened men. I don't know where they're holed up, but they've been in the area for a while. They're like a pack of wolves, waiting for the right moment." A pack of wolves. Mallister's jaw clenched. He'd dealt with wolves before, both literal and metaphorical, and he knew that if you let them get too comfortable, they would tear everything apart. He didn't intend to give Graydon the chance. "You know where they're hiding?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, but the edge in it told Mallister that she wasn't just looking for answers. She was already thinking about the next move. The bartender shook his head. "Could be anywhere. They're good at staying hidden. But if you're looking for them, I'd bet they're camped out near the old canyon, about a mile north of here. There's a water source there, and it's the perfect spot to lie low. But you're not going to take them out by just charging in there. It's too open." Mallister turned back towards Sarah, his expression unreadable. He had spent too many years in places like this, working on too little information, too little time. But it wasn't as if they had a choice. They couldn't wait for Graydon to come to them. They had to strike first. "You heard him," Mallister said, his voice firm. "We can't afford to wait. We need to take them out before they get any closer." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of understanding and determination. She wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, and she wasn't about to start now. "Then we go in tonight. Get them while they're still camped out. We can catch them off guard." Mallister nodded. "It's risky, but we don't have time to make another plan. If we wait, we'll be the ones sitting ducks." The bartender looked at the two of them, his face pale, but he didn't say anything. He knew better than to try and talk Mallister out of it. "We'll need supplies," Sarah said, already moving toward the back of the saloon. "We can't go in half prepared. I'll gather what we need." Mallister stayed behind for a moment, his gaze lingering on the bartender. He didn't trust many people in a town like this, but right now, he needed help. The town might not be much, but it was home to people who were now caught in the crossfire of something much bigger than they could handle. "You keep your head down," Mallister said to the bartender. "When we're gone, keep the rest of the town in line. And if anyone asks, we never came through here." The bartender nodded quickly, his face grim. "Understood. I'll keep things quiet." Mallister turned and walked toward the door, Sarah already gathering their things in the back. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This wasn't just about saving Red Rock anymore. It was about settling something long overdue. Outside, The rain had turned into a steady downpour, the world around him dark and soaked. The road ahead would be difficult, but Mallister had fought harder battles. It was time to finish this. The storm was just beginning, and the real fight was about to start. The night had fully taken over, the storm now a steady roar overhead, as Mallister and Sarah made their way toward the canyon. The wind was sharp, carrying the smell of rain and earth, and the ground beneath their horses was slick with the downpour. It was the kind of night that made a man feel like the world was against him, but Mallister had long since made peace with such things. The storm, the darkness, it didn't matter. What mattered was the fight ahead, and he was ready for it. "We'll have to move fast once we get there," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the noise of the rain. "They're likely holed up in the canyon, and we won't have the element of surprise for long." Mallister nodded, his face grim. He had been in worse situations, but this one had the feel of something different. Graydon's men were ruthless, and they had numbers. The canyon was the perfect place for an ambush. They would need to outsmart the outlaws if they were going to survive. "You keep to the left," Mallister instructed, his voice steady but low. "I'll take the right. We'll cover each other, but don't engage unless you have to. We can't afford to make noise." Sarah acknowledged him with a sharp nod, her rifle now at the ready as they pressed forward through the rain. The sound of their horses' hooves was muffled by the thick mud, making their approach almost silent. But Mallister knew that silence wouldn't last forever. They were getting closer to the canyon, and soon, they would have no choice but to confront Graydon and his gang. As they neared the mouth of the canyon, Mallister could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when something didn't feel right, and the stillness of the canyon wasn't reassuring. The heavy rain had obscured the usual sounds of wildlife, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. "Stay sharp," Mallister murmured, his hand instinctively moving to his revolver. "If they're here, they're waiting." Sarah's eyes scanned the area, her posture tense. "We can't afford to walk into an ambush. We need to make sure they don't know we're coming." Mallister agreed, but the canyon was narrow, the walls steep on either side. There was little cover, and moving silently was becoming more difficult with every step. They were nearly at the entrance, and Mallister's mind raced through the plan. It was risky, but it was all they had. They would hit hard and fast, take down as many as they could, and then get the hell out before Graydon's gang had the chance to regroup. They dismounted a short distance from the entrance, tying their horses to a nearby tree. Mallister motioned for Sarah to follow him as they approached the edge of the canyon. The wind had picked up, pushing the rain sideways and making it harder to see. The faint light from the moon was barely enough to make out the shadows of the canyon walls. Then, just as Mallister had expected, a figure appeared, silhouetted against the dark sky. A man, one of Graydon's gang, was standing near a small campfire, his rifle slung over his back. He didn't seem to notice Mallister and Sarah creeping closer, the sound of the rain masking their movements. Mallister's hand went to his revolver, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. They needed to take the man down quietly, get him out of the way before the rest of the gang realized what was happening. Mallister motioned for Sarah to move around to the side, while he stayed where he was, ready to make his move. As Sarah moved into position, Mallister's eyes never left the man by the fire. His breath was slow, controlled. He had done this 1,000 times, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And this time, it would be no different. The man by the fire shifted slightly, his attention still focused on the flames. Mallister knew he had a few seconds, just enough to close the distance. He moved forward, his boots barely making a sound in the wet mud. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small knife, and with one swift motion, he moved up behind the man. Before the outlaw had time to react, Mallister pressed the blade to his throat. The man froze, his breath caught in his chest, his rifle still hanging loosely at his side. "Don't move," Mallister whispered, his voice low and dangerous. The outlaw's hands went up slowly, his eyes wide with fear. He could feel the sharp edge of the knife against his skin, and Mallister could see the realization dawn on him that he had just made a fatal mistake. "I won't make a sound," the outlaw mumbled, his voice trembling. Mallister didn't reply. Instead, He motioned for Sarah to join him, and the two of them quickly bound the man's hands. He wasn't a threat anymore, at least, not for the moment. They needed information, and Mallister wasn't about to let him go until they got it. "Where are the others?" Mallister asked, his tone firm but calm. The outlaw swallowed, his eyes darting nervously around the canyon. "They're further in, behind the rocks," he said quickly. "Graydon's with them. They're waiting for someone to come out of town. They're not expecting anyone to be stupid enough to come here." Mallister's brow furrowed. That was what he had feared. They were waiting for Red Rock to send someone to try to fight them. They had underestimated him, and that was a mistake they would regret. "We're not here to let you warn them," Mallister said, his voice cold. He nodded to Sarah, and without another word, they moved swiftly toward the heart of the canyon. The deeper they went, the more the sound of the rain drowned out the noise of their movement. Mallister kept his revolver ready, every sense on high alert. He could feel the presence of the gang before he saw them. He could smell their smoke, hear the crackling of their campfire up ahead. They were close. Mallister signaled for Sarah to stop, his eyes scanning the dark shadows in front of them. The campfire flickered ahead, casting an eerie light over the group of men huddled around it. Graydon's gang was gathered in a loose circle, laughing and talking, clearly unaware of the approaching threat. Mallister motioned for Sarah to take the left, while he circled around to the right. They would hit fast, hit hard. The element of surprise was on their side. This was their moment. The rain had begun to fall in sheets, making the earth slick and treacherous beneath their feet. Mallister crouched low against the rocky outcrop, his eyes fixed on the small campfire flickering ahead. The outlaws were spread out, clustered in a loose circle, their laughter carrying in the damp air. They were completely unaware of the two figures closing in on them from both sides. Mallister's breath was steady, his movements slow and deliberate. His years of experience had taught him how to move through the shadows, how to stay hidden until the moment was right. Tonight, everything depended on timing and precision. He motioned to Sarah, who was crouched low to his left. She had moved silently through the rain-soaked terrain, positioning herself for the attack. He couldn't see her face, but he knew she was ready. The firelight reflected off the metal of her rifle, her figure a blur in the night. She was waiting for the signal, just as he was. Mallister took a slow, deliberate step forward, making sure his boots didn't slide on the wet rocks beneath him. The outlaws were still unaware of their approach. He could see them clearly now, their faces illuminated by the weak light of the fire, their guns resting lazily on the ground beside them. They looked too comfortable, too sure of themselves. It was exactly what Mallister had hoped for. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of anger as he looked at them. These were men who had been terrorizing towns for weeks, taking what they wanted without remorse. They had no respect for anything, least of all, the people they hurt. Mallister had made up his mind long ago that he wouldn't let men like these get away with it. Not anymore. Sarah's form disappeared into the shadows to his left, and Mallister took another slow step forward. The time had come. He could feel the weight of his revolver at his side, the familiar presence of the weapon reminding him that he wasn't the man he used to be. He was still fast, still precise, but he wasn't invincible. Mallister steadied himself, his fingers twitching around the grip of his revolver. The rain was coming down harder now, but that didn't matter. It wouldn't drown out the sound of gunfire. He was ready for what was to come. The signal came from Sarah, a single, sharp whistle that broke the silence of the night. It was a signal Mallister had learned to trust over the years. Without hesitation, he moved. Mallister burst from the shadows, his revolver already drawn. The outlaws barely had time to react. The first shot rang out, quick, clean, and the man closest to him dropped without a sound, his body crumpling to the ground like a rag doll. Mallister's revolver was already back in his hand, his aim steady as he fired again, taking down another outlaw before they even had time to grab their weapons. The campfire's glow flickered as chaos erupted. The remaining men scrambled to draw their guns, but Mallister was faster. Another shot rang out, another man went down. In the midst of the chaos, Sarah's rifle echoed through the night, sending a bullet into one of the outlaws as he tried to scramble for cover. Mallister moved with practiced speed, his feet sure on the slippery ground as he took cover behind a large boulder. The remaining outlaws were disoriented, their guns drawn but fumbling. One of them fired wild shots in Mallister's direction, but he was already gone, moving through the shadows, his revolver aimed at the next target. The rain lashed against Mallister's face, but he didn't feel it. His focus was razor-sharp, his movements fluid, as he closed in on the last two outlaws. They were panicking now, realizing that they had underestimated the old man. Mallister had taken out their numbers with methodical precision, and now they were the ones in danger. "Where's Graydon?" Mallister shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. One of the remaining outlaws looked around, his eyes wide with panic, but before he could answer, Mallister's revolver was already aimed at him. The shot was quick and clean, and the outlaw crumpled to the ground. The last man standing looked around desperately, his hand trembling as he reached for his gun. But Mallister was already there, his gun aimed at the man's chest. There was no hesitation. "I'll ask you one more time," Mallister said, his voice low and commanding. "Where is Graydon?" The outlaw swallowed hard, his eyes darting between Mallister and the gun aimed at him. "He's in the back," the man muttered, his voice shaking. "Behind the rocks. He's got two others with him. He's got a gun aimed at you, old man." Mallister didn't flinch. He wasn't worried about Graydon. The outlaws had made their move, and now it was his turn. He motioned for Sarah to stay put, his eyes scanning the terrain. He could feel the weight of his revolver in his hand, his heart steady as he prepared for the final confrontation. Without another word, Mallister moved toward the back of the canyon, his gun ready. The last outlaw fell silent as Mallister disappeared into the shadows, his figure becoming one with the rain-soaked night. He could feel it now, the tension that had been building for hours, the inevitability of what was to come. Graydon and his men were waiting for him, but Mallister wasn't worried. He had fought harder battles than this. He had faced worse odds and come out on top. And tonight would be no different. Graydon wouldn't know what hit him. The storm was raging now, the sound of thunder mingling with the crackle of the rain. But Mallister was undeterred. This was his fight, and it was time to end it. The canyon's mouth was narrow, the walls rising steeply on either side, creating a tunnel-like effect that made Mallister feel like he was walking into the jaws of a beast. The rain had not let up. If anything, it seemed to intensify with each passing moment, pouring down in sheets and turning the rocky ground into slippery mud. The sound of the storm filled his ears, the thunder rumbling in the distance like a warning. Mallister's eyes stayed focused on the shadows ahead. Graydon and his remaining men were waiting for him, thinking they had the upper hand. They always did. It was their mistake, and Mallister wasn't about to let them get away with it. He moved forward cautiously, his boots making soft, squelching sounds in the mud. The only other sound was the occasional rustle of wind and the distant crash of thunder. He had learned long ago that you couldn't be too careful when dealing with men like Graydon. They were dangerous, unpredictable, and they played dirty. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, the rain began to lessen slightly, but the thick air made it harder to see. Mallister squinted through the gloom, trying to make out any movement in the distance. That's when he saw it, a faint outline of a campfire, its light flickering through the darkness. Graydon and his two remaining men were huddled around it, their faces shadowed in the dim light. They hadn't heard him yet. Mallister crouched low, moving to the side and keeping to the cover of the canyon wall. His heart beat steadily, the adrenaline flowing through him like a familiar current. He didn't need to rush. The advantage was still his. They had no idea he was so close, and if he played his cards right, he could finish this quickly. He glanced over his shoulder to see Sarah still waiting at the top of the canyon. She was 100 yards behind him, keeping an eye on the back entrance, ready to back him up if anything went wrong. Mallister trusted her, and right now, he needed that trust. The timing had to be perfect. Taking a deep breath, Mallister moved toward the campfire, inching forward through the rain, staying in the shadows. His revolver was still in his hand, but he hadn't drawn it yet. He wasn't going to shoot unless he had to. This was a precision job, a clean kill, if possible. His mind was calm, his nerves steady. Graydon's voice carried through the night, low and gravelly, his words thick with arrogance. "Those damn fools won't know what hit them," Graydon muttered. "We've been running this game for weeks, and nobody's been able to touch us. We'll wipe this place off the map. This whole damn territory will be ours." Mallister didn't need to hear any more. He had enough. He couldn't let men like Graydon get away with that kind of talk. Not anymore. He picked up the pace, moving faster now, keeping low to the ground, his boots making barely a sound. The campfire flickered ahead, illuminating the figures of Graydon and his two men. They were relaxed, confident, just as Mallister had expected. Their guns were holstered loosely at their sides, their attention on the fire, the storm, and their plans for what came next. Mallister's heart rate picked up. He was close, too close for them to react in time. He drew his revolver with a speed that could only come from years of practice, his finger brushing the trigger as he aimed at Graydon. The first shot was quick, sharp, and without hesitation. The bullet hit one of Graydon's men square in the chest, sending him tumbling backward with a gasp. The sound of the shot was drowned out by the roar of the storm, but the reaction was instant. Graydon and the other man scrambled to draw their guns, but Mallister was faster. He fired again, his aim true, and Graydon's second man collapsed, his gun falling uselessly to the ground. Graydon himself barely had time to raise his gun before Mallister's revolver was aimed directly at his chest. The outlaw leader froze, his hand trembling around the grip of his revolver. His eyes locked with Mallister's, wide with disbelief. "You're done, Graydon," Mallister said calmly, his voice low but firm. "This town's not yours anymore." Graydon's hand tightened around the handle of his gun, but he didn't make a move. He knew the situation. He had seen men like Mallister before. Men who didn't hesitate, men who didn't waste time with threats or posturing. "I'm not finished yet," Graydon growled, his eyes flashing with anger. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man. You think this is over?" Mallister's finger tightened on the trigger. His aim didn't waver. "It is for you," he replied, his voice like ice. "And if you make another move, it'll be the last one you ever take." For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain. Graydon's chest heaved with every breath, his eyes still locked on Mallister. He could see the calm determination in the older man's eyes, the unwavering certainty that Mallister wasn't bluffing. The game was up. Finally, Graydon lowered his weapon, his shoulders slumping with defeat. "You think you've won?" He spat, his voice bitter. "You think this town's gonna remember you as a hero?" Mallister didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, his gun still aimed at Graydon's chest. The outlaw leader's arrogance had been his downfall. Mallister had given him a choice, surrender or die. Graydon had chosen poorly. "You're not the first man to try to take this town," Mallister said, his voice cold. "And you won't be the last. But you won't be around to try again." With a final, swift motion, Mallister fired. The shot was quick and clean, hitting Graydon square in the chest. The outlaw leader crumpled to the ground, his body twitching once before going still. Mallister stood over him, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. It was over. Graydon and his gang were no more. Red Rock was safe, for now. He turned back to Sarah, who had come down from her position to join him. She looked at the fallen outlaws, her face hard but with a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. Mallister holstered his revolver and looked back at the town in the distance, the storm still raging around them. He couldn't answer her question. "Not yet. It's over for them," he said finally. But the West doesn't stay quiet for long. The storm had finally begun to let up, the rain slowing to a drizzle as Mallister and Sarah stood over the bodies of the fallen outlaws. The canyon was eerily quiet now, save for the distant sound of thunder fading into the night. The wet earth beneath their feet was slick, the smell of rain mixing with the scent of gunpowder and the smoke from the extinguished campfire. Mallister wiped the rain from his brow and took a deep breath, his chest still heavy with the weight of the fight. He wasn't a man who enjoyed killing. He never had been. But tonight, there had been no other choice. He had done what needed to be done to protect the town, to stop men like Graydon from spreading their poison further. But in his heart, Mallister knew the cost of such actions. Every life taken left a mark, no matter how just the cause. We got them all, Sarah said, her voice calm but edged with the exhaustion of the moment. She lowered her rifle, her eyes scanning the bodies of the outlaws. Mallister nodded, but the sense of victory didn't settle in him the way it should have. For now, he muttered. But you know as well as I do, Sarah, men like Gren don't stay dead for long. There will be more. Sarah gave him a sharp glance. You're always looking for the next fight, aren't you? Mallister met her gaze, his expression hard. I'm not looking for trouble, but it finds me just the same. They stood there for a moment, the rain pattering softly on the rocks around them, the weight of the night pressing down on them. The air was heavy, and Mallister could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones. It had been a long time since he had been in the thick of a fight like that, and the toll was more than physical. His mind was racing, replaying the gunfight in his head, the way it had all played out in an instant, like a well-rehearsed routine. But routine didn't make it any easier. There was always a price to pay. Let's get back to town, Mallister said after a beat, his voice quieter now. We can't leave the bodies out here for too long. Sarah didn't respond immediately, but Mallister could tell by the way she looked at him that she understood. There was no glory in this, no celebration. It was just another day in the life of a man who had long since learned that peace was temporary, and that trouble was always just around the corner. They walked back toward their horses, moving carefully over the slick ground. Mallister kept his revolver close, but his movements were slow, deliberate. He wasn't worried about an ambush, at least not right now, but he didn't take any chances. The ride back to Red Rock was quiet, the storm now reduced to a light drizzle that fell in sheets around them, the wind howling through the canyon walls. The town was still far off in the distance, its outline barely visible in the night. The glow of the lanterns in the windows was a welcome sight, but Mallister knew that the fight wasn't over. Gren's gang had been taken down, but there would always be more. The West was full of men like them, and Mallister had long ago given up hope of changing that. His only choice now was to survive. When they finally reached the outskirts of Red Rock, the first rays of dawn were starting to break through the clouds, casting a soft light over the town. The streets were quiet, but Mallister could sense the tension in the air. The townspeople had heard the gunshots. They would be waiting for news. He and Sarah rode into the center of town, dismounting in front of the saloon. The town's few remaining residents began to gather around, some cautiously approaching while others stayed back, watching from the windows. Mallister's eyes met the bartender's, who stepped forward from the doorway. You did it, the bartender said quietly, his voice full of respect and something else. Relief, maybe. You really did it. Mallister nodded, but said nothing. He wasn't looking for gratitude. He was just a man trying to survive in a world that wasn't kind to people like him. He glanced over at Sarah, who was already heading toward the back door of the saloon. She had done her part, and now she was content to disappear into the shadows, as she always did. The bartender hesitated, then spoke again. They won't come back right away, will they? Mallister turned to face him, his face unreadable. Doesn't work like that. Men like Gren, they never just give up. But we've bought some time. The bartender nodded slowly, his face still filled with a mixture of awe and fear. So, what now? We wait for them to come again? Mallister's gaze shifted toward the horizon, where the storm clouds were beginning to clear. The town, small and quiet, seemed peaceful now, but that peace was fragile. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything could come crashing down. No, Mallister said, his voice steady. Now we get ready. He walked past the bartender, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, and stepped outside into the soft light of morning. The town was silent, the streets still empty. Mallister knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. As he looked around, the reality of the situation set in. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The outlaws had been a threat to Red Rock, but they weren't the only threat. There would always be more men like Gren, always more violence, always more bloodshed. Mallister had spent his life running from that truth, but now, he had no choice but to face it head-on. The question wasn't whether the fight was over. The question was how long they could hold out before the next storm arrived. And Mallister knew. He would face it alone, if he had to. The sun had risen higher by the time Mallister made his way down the main street of Red Rock. The light, still pale from the morning storm, cast long shadows across the wet earth. He could hear the distant murmurs of the townsfolk, hesitant whispers that carried with the wind as people went about their business, trying to regain a sense of normalcy after the chaos of the past few days. Mallister had seen it all before. The uneasy calm that followed a fight, the uncertainty that gnawed at a town's spirit long after the bullets had stopped flying. The people of Red Rock were no different than the many small towns he'd passed through in his life. They were just trying to survive. And now, with Gren and his men gone, they had a chance to do so, for a little while longer, at least. As he walked past the saloon, he noticed the bartender again, standing at the doorway with a weathered look on his face. The man didn't speak immediately, but he gave Mallister a nod, a silent acknowledgement of what had been done. Mallister gave a brief nod in return, but his eyes were already scanning the town, searching for the next move. The quiet was unnerving. The saloon, normally bustling with activity, was empty now. Even the usual stragglers who occupied the benches in front of the general store were nowhere to be seen. Mallister could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on him. It was only a matter of time before someone or something broke it. "You did good." Sarah's voice suddenly came from behind him, breaking his thoughts. He turned to see her approaching, her steps light and swift despite the rain-slick streets. She looked different now, tired, but with a sense of satisfaction that Mallister hadn't seen before. He gave her a quick glance but didn't slow his pace. "I did what needed to be done, but that's not over yet." Sarah didn't argue. She fell into step beside him, her gaze moving over the town, scanning the windows and doorways for any signs of movement. "You're right," she said after a moment. "You've taken down Gren, but that's just one group of men. The rest? They won't just disappear." Mallister stopped in front of the general store, his hand resting on the wooden post beside it. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon. The canyon they had just come from was barely visible in the distance, shrouded by low-hanging clouds. He could almost feel the weight of what had been done, the consequences of killing Gren and his men. It wasn't the end of the road. It was just another turn. "You know as well as I do," Mallister said quietly, "there will always be more. Men like Gren don't just disappear. They don't stay down." Sarah nodded, her eyes hardening. "You think they'll come back?" "Don't know, but I can't afford to sit around waiting to find out." Mallister turned toward the saloon and walked inside. Sarah followed. The door creaked open, the familiar scent of whiskey and damp wood filling the air. A few of the townsfolk had trickled back in, their faces tense as they watched Mallister walk past them. He didn't acknowledge them, didn't need to. They had seen what he'd done. That was enough for now. The bartender was behind the counter, polishing a glass with a rag, his eyes meeting Mallister's. He looked tired, but there was a hint of relief in his gaze. "Looks like you won," the bartender said, his voice quiet but steady. Mallister gave him a brief nod. "For now. But I'm not done here." The bartender raised an eyebrow. "You think Gren's men will be back?" "I don't think," Mallister replied, his voice low. "I know. They won't stop just because their leader's dead. There's always someone else, someone hungry for power. The West doesn't rest." Sarah stepped forward, her expression serious. "What's the plan then? We can't keep hiding forever." Mallister turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "We don't hide. We get ready. We prepare for what's coming next." The bartender set the glass down, wiping his hands on his apron. "You're talking about fortifying this town, aren't you?" Mallister nodded, his jaw tightening. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. We need to make sure that when they come back, they don't get what they expect." The bartender gave him a long look before nodding slowly. "You're right. I'll spread the word. We need to start working on it now." Mallister turned and walked back outside, Sarah right behind him. The town was still quiet, but the change was in the air now. The people knew what was coming. They could feel it. The question wasn't whether they would fight. The question was whether they were ready for it. As Mallister walked toward the hitching post, his mind raced through the steps they would need to take. They couldn't rely on just one or two people to defend Red Rock. They needed every able-bodied person in town to stand and fight. The next time Graydon's men, or anyone like them, came, it wouldn't be a simple skirmish. It would be an all-out war. And if Mallister had his way, this time, they wouldn't lose. "I'll start gathering supplies," Sarah said, breaking his thoughts. "We'll need food, ammunition, and tools for barricades." Mallister glanced at her, his eyes sharp. "Don't do anything alone. Get the townsfolk involved. If we're going to survive what's coming, we have to do it together." She gave him a nod, the weight of the task ahead clear on her face. But there was something else there too. A spark, a willingness to fight. Mallister could see it. They were ready, and so was he. He turned toward the horizon once more, feeling the pull of the storm that had already begun to settle into the air. The calm before the storm, he thought. They had bought time, but only a little. The real fight was about to begin. The days following Mallister's confrontation with Graydon's gang were tense, filled with the heavy task of preparing for whatever came next. Red Rock, though small and quiet, was beginning to feel the weight of the coming storm. The townsfolk, still nervous from the violence they had witnessed, were slowly gathering themselves, ready to stand their ground. Mallister knew, however, that no amount of preparation could guarantee their safety. The West was a lawless place, and trouble didn't just go away because you had a few walls up and a plan in place. Mallister spent the next day walking the town, offering guidance where he could and assessing what was needed. He had made it clear to the people of Red Rock that they weren't just going to wait around for the next gang to come through. This time, they were going to fight back, and they needed to be ready. He found himself in front of the general store, where a few of the ranchers were already talking in hushed voices, gathering supplies and sharing what little ammunition they had. The store's owner, a stout, middle-aged man named Bill, was trying to organize the chaos. His face was drawn, his hands shaking slightly as he stacked crates of goods behind the counter. The sight of him, usually so steady, only underscored how much fear had taken hold of the town. "Mallister," Bill called as he saw the old cowboy approach. I didn't think we'd be seeing you back here so soon. Thought you'd be off somewhere, out of the way." Mallister leaned against the counter, his gaze hard. "You think I'm going to let this place fall to a bunch of outlaws? I'm not going anywhere, Bill. And neither should you." Bill nodded, though his eyes were filled with doubt. "It's just, we're not fighters, Mallister. Some of us can shoot a rifle, sure, but not like you. Not like Sarah." Sarah had been doing her part, rallying the town's ranchers and farmers, teaching them how to use weapons and reinforcing the importance of holding their ground. She was every bit the leader Mallister had hoped for. She'd earned her place in this fight. "We don't need everyone to be a gunslinger," Mallister said, his voice low but firm. "We just need people who are willing to fight for their homes." "You can do that, Bill. You just need to believe it." Bill shifted his weight uneasily, but said nothing in response. He was a good man, and Mallister could see the hesitation in his eyes. But the time for hesitation was over. There was no room for doubt when survival was on the line. "Help me get these supplies ready," Mallister said, his tone softening slightly. "We'll need food, water, and all the ammunition we can get. Anything you have." Bill gave a nod and moved to gather the supplies, his shoulders slumping as he worked. The store was becoming a base of operations, a place to keep everything together. The townsfolk would need to be ready when the time came. Mallister's eyes scanned the room. He could see the uncertainty in the faces of the people here. They weren't soldiers, and many of them were too old, too young, or too inexperienced to fight. But they weren't helpless either. They were resilient, and Mallister would make sure they understood that. As the day wore on, Mallister and Sarah moved through the town, talking to everyone they could, organizing groups, teaching those who had never held a weapon how to defend themselves. The message was simple. This town was their home, and they would fight for it. But it wasn't going to be easy. Graydon's gang wasn't the last group of outlaws they would face, and Mallister knew the road ahead would be long. By dusk, the townspeople had gathered in the saloon, the only place big enough to hold them all. They were anxious, restless, but there was something else in the air now, a sense of purpose. Mallister stood at the front, looking out over the crowd, his eyes scanning their faces. "I've been to more towns than I care to count," Mallister began, his voice steady. "And I've seen what happens when people don't stand up for themselves. I've seen what happens when good men, good women, sit by and wait for someone else to fix their problems. And I've seen what happens when people decide to fight back." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Now, I'm not going to tell you that it'll be easy. We've got a tough road ahead. But I promise you this, we stand together and we stand strong. That's the only chance we've got." He saw a few faces shift in the crowd, some uncertain, others with a spark of resolve. Mallister knew that there would be fear. There would be doubts. But if they were going to survive, they would have to believe in each other. And that belief was something Mallister would help them build, step by step. As the meeting continued, they made plans. Sarah was working with the ranchers to fortify the western side of the town. Mallister would focus on the east. They needed barricades, lookout points, and weapons strategically placed around the perimeter. They couldn't wait for Graydon's men to get close. They would meet them on their terms, before they had the chance to strike. The hours passed quickly as they made their plans, and soon the saloon emptied. Mallister and Sarah were among the last to leave, their bodies exhausted but their minds sharp. "We've got a lot of work to do," Sarah said as they walked out into the night. "And not much time." Mallister didn't respond at first. He was looking up at the sky, where the last remnants of the storm clouds were drifting away. The moon was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the town. It was strange. After everything that had happened, the town seemed peaceful again, almost as if nothing had changed. But Mallister knew better. "Tomorrow, we'll be ready," he said, his voice steady but filled with something else, something heavier. "Tomorrow, we make our stand." The night passed slowly for Mallister. After the meeting in the saloon, the town had returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the weight of the coming battle hung heavy in the air. The people of Red Rock had gathered together, their nerves frayed but their resolve hardening. They were no soldiers, but they were no longer strangers to the violence that could come from the west. Mallister sat in his small room at the back of the saloon, a single lantern casting a faint glow across the wooden walls. He was alone, the quiet of the room echoing in his ears as his thoughts turned inward. The day's events had taken their toll. The preparation, the organizing, the weight of knowing that what lay ahead was uncertain. It all pressed in on him. Outside, the wind howled, the storm long gone but leaving behind an uneasy calm. The streets were empty now, the saloon silent except for the occasional voice that could be heard from the main room. Mallister didn't hear the words, but the laughter had stopped. The worry was settling in. He reached down to his saddlebags, pulling out a weathered, old photo. It was one of many he carried, of a life long past, a world he had hoped to leave behind. His fingers brushed across the edges of the picture, the faces of people he once loved. His heart tightened. This life he had chosen, the one he had tried to run from for so long, always seemed to find him. And it had found him again in Red Rock. Mallister set the photo back down, closing his eyes for a moment. He had fought battles like this before, but it had been years since he had felt the weight of responsibility the way he did now. This time, it wasn't just his life on the line. It was the lives of those who had put their trust in him. He would do whatever it took to protect them, but Mallister knew that in the end, there would be consequences. There always were. A knock at the door broke through his thoughts. He stood up, pushing the chair back with a creak, and moved toward it. The hinges groaned as he opened the door to reveal Sarah, her face just as weary as his. "We're ready," she said, her voice steady, but Mallister could hear the hint of uncertainty in it. "The barricades are set, and the watch is in place. But we both know it's not enough to just wait for them to come." Mallister nodded. "It's never enough." She stepped inside, shutting the door behind her. The faint light of the lantern caught the edges of her face, casting shadows across her features. Sarah had become more than just an ally in the past days. She was the one person he trusted to see this through, the one person who could handle herself just as well in a fight as she could handle a rifle. He could see the determination in her eyes, but there was also something else. Something that spoke to the fear they both felt, the realization that they were about to enter something far darker than they had anticipated. "I was thinking," Sarah began, her voice quiet, "that maybe we should take the fight to them. If they're going to come for us, we might as well show them we're not waiting for them to knock down the door." McAllister glanced at her, considering her words. The thought of taking the fight to the enemy was dangerous, but it had merit. It would give them the element of surprise, and if they struck quickly, they might stand a chance of stopping Graydon and his men before they could regroup. He rubbed his chin, the stubble on his face rough against his palm. "You're right, but we have to be smart about it. We don't know how many of them are left. We don't know where they've set up or how far they'll go to finish this." "I'll take the west side," Sarah said, already making her decision. "You take the east. We don't need to cover every inch of the town. Just the main roads, the places we know they'll come from." McAllister hesitated for a moment. "And what about the others?" "They'll be ready. We just have to make sure they know where to fight and where to fall back to." McAllister's eyes narrowed, weighing the risk, but in his gut, he felt the stirrings of a plan forming. They didn't have the luxury of time. If they were going to do this, it had to be now. "We move out at first light," he said, his voice resolute. "We hit them hard and fast. No hesitation." Sarah's eyes met his, and for a moment, they shared a silent understanding. The road ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were high. But there was no going back now. If they didn't fight, if they didn't stand up for their home, then Red Rock would fall like so many others before it. And McAllister wasn't about to let that happen. "First light," she echoed, a hint of resolve settling into her tone. "I'll get the others ready." McAllister didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his coat, pulling it over his shoulders. He could feel the weight of the coming fight pressing on him, the calm before the storm that had already settled over the town. He could sense the uncertainty in the air, the way people were still moving with caution, unsure of what would happen next. It wasn't just the storm outside that made the air feel thick. It was the weight of the fight that was about to unfold. He walked toward the door, opening it slowly. The town was quiet, the streets empty in the dead of night. He looked up at the moon, watching the pale light shift behind the clouds. There was a stillness in the air, a final breath before the chaos. McAllister took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was what he had trained for. This was what he had been running from all these years. The final fight for Red Rock was about to begin. The first light of dawn broke across Red Rock, painting the sky a pale shade of pink and orange. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a heavy mist that clung to the ground, soaking everything in its path. The streets were still quiet, but McAllister could feel the tension thickening in the air. Every man and woman in town knew that the fight was coming, and it was coming fast. McAllister stood outside the saloon, watching as the few remaining people trickled out of their homes, their eyes filled with unease but also determination. He saw the ranchers, the farmers, the miners, everyone who had once been just a face in the crowd now standing together, ready to fight for their homes. It was a far cry from the sleepy town Red Rock had once been. Now, it was a town on the edge, its future hanging by a thread. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Sarah approaching, her expression set in stone. She was armed, just as McAllister was, with a rifle slung over her back and her revolver strapped to her side. The same quiet confidence he had seen in her the past few days was there again. But now, it was tempered with the cold reality of what lay ahead. "We're ready," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in the air. "I've sent out word to the others. They know where to be." McAllister gave her a single nod, his eyes scanning the town again. Everything seemed too quiet. He had fought in enough gunfights to know that this kind of silence was unnatural. It was the calm before the storm. He shifted his weight and started walking toward the east side of town, his boots heavy against the wet ground. Sarah followed at his side, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, taking in every detail. They were getting closer to the edge of town, the narrow street stretching ahead of them, empty except for the occasional wagon or horse. "It won't be long now," McAllister muttered. "No," Sarah replied, "but we've got to be ready. I don't like how quiet it is. If they're coming, they're going to come in full force." McAllister's gaze remained fixed ahead, his mind racing. He wasn't as young as he used to be, and his reflexes weren't as sharp as they once had been. But that didn't matter now. He had to make sure this town had a chance. This was his fight, his responsibility, and he wouldn't let it slip away. They reached the center of town, where the townsfolk had gathered. The people were armed, their faces a mixture of fear and determination, just as Mallister had expected. There weren't many, but there didn't need to be. It wasn't about numbers, it was about heart. He walked toward the group, his voice low but commanding as he addressed them. "Listen up," he called, and the group immediately quieted. "They're coming. Gren and his gang will be here soon. We've got to stand firm. When they hit us, we hit back. No hesitation. You protect your homes, your families. You fight for this town, and we'll make sure they know this is our land, not theirs." There was a murmur of agreement from the townsfolk. Some faces were still uncertain, others filled with resolve. Mallister saw Bill, the storekeeper, standing near the edge of the group. The man's hands were shaking, but he was holding his rifle steady. "You ready, Bill?" Mallister asked, his voice softer now. Bill looked at him, his face pale but determined. "I'll do what I can," he said, his voice gruff. "Good man," Mallister replied. Sarah moved to stand beside him, her expression set. "We've fortified the main roads," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The lookout points are set. If they try to approach from any direction, we'll know." Mallister turned to her, giving a slight nod. "We need to be quick. We take the first shot, and we take it hard. No second chances." Sarah stepped back, readying her rifle. "We'll be with you." Mallister watched her move off to her position, his eyes scanning the rest of the town. The streets were quiet now, the only sounds the occasional creak of wood from the buildings and the faint rustle of the wind. Minutes felt like hours as Mallister stood at the ready. His hand never left his revolver, and his eyes never strayed from the street. He knew the outlaws were coming. They had to be. But where were they? Why hadn't they made their move yet? The first sign came as a faint movement at the far end of the street. Mallister's heart skipped a beat. He saw it, a shadow moving quickly behind the buildings. He motioned to Sarah, signaling her to take cover. They hadn't been waiting for long. The first wave of Gren's men appeared at the edge of town, riding in fast, their horses kicking up mud as they thundered down the street. Mallister's pulse quickened as the first group came into view. 8 riders, their guns drawn and ready. Mallister wasted no time. He drew his revolver and fired a shot into the air, the sound echoing through the canyon. It was the signal. The first shot had been fired, and now the battle was upon them. The first outlaw fell, his horse rearing as the bullet struck him square in the chest. The rest of the outlaws scattered, scrambling to find cover as Mallister and the townsfolk opened fire. The sound of gunshots rang through the air as Mallister moved quickly, his eyes sharp as he picked off one outlaw after another, his hands steady as ever. But the outlaws weren't giving up easily. They returned fire, and Mallister ducked behind cover, his heart racing as he focused on the battle in front of him. The streets of Red Rock had become a battleground, and Mallister was right in the middle of it. He could hear Sarah's rifle crack through the air, each shot finding its mark. She was keeping them pinned down, providing cover for the townsfolk to move into position. The outlaws were starting to retreat, but Mallister knew it wasn't over. Gren would have a backup plan. "We've got to hold them," Mallister shouted to the townsfolk. "Don't let them regroup." The fight raged on, and Mallister's mind raced as he continued to fire, taking down outlaw after outlaw. The adrenaline was pumping, but his focus never wavered. He couldn't afford to let up, not now. The town depended on him. As the last of the outlaws fell, Mallister stood, scanning the street for any sign of Gren. But it was quiet again. The sound of the rain began to fill the space as the last of the tension seeped out of the air. Mallister stepped forward, his revolver still in hand, and surveyed the aftermath of the battle. Red Rock had stood firm, but he knew that this wasn't the end. Gren and his gang had come. They had attacked, but Mallister had fought back, and Red Rock would survive. For now, if you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.